Hey everybody. So this week's video is a little different. I don't have the music in the background. It's a little more somber. I want to talk about some of the things that are taking place right now. The events that are happening in our country right now. We have a lot of brokenness, a lot of stress, a lot of tension as a result of the coronavirus and other things that have happened. And then on top of that, we have all witnessed the murder of George Floyd as he spent 9 minutes gasping for breath, crying out for his mom before he finally passed out and died unnecessarily. This murder that took place was just one in a series that came around recently. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, whose murder was covered up for 2 months before the video finally came to light. This week I reread Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And this letter was in response to the criticisms he received from white pastors and white churches about the protests that he was leading in Birmingham and throughout the South during the Civil Rights Movement. Often it was said that he was inciting violence, that he was acting in bad faith, that he was pushing things too hard and too far, creating tension where there didn't need to be tension. And I reread this letter because it reminds me of my responsibility as a pastor when you're facing times of racial injustice. I want to highlight a couple of things that he wrote in this letter. He wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." The reality is that America's original sin is racism. Starting with slavery, continuing through Jim Crow, the genocide of Native Americans, the internment camps of Asian Americans, continuing today with mass incarceration and economic injustices. The reality is that it's not just excessive force and police brutality that threaten the lives of people of color in our country. A disproportionate number of people of color in our country have died from the coronavirus. A disproportionate number of people in our country have been affected economically in this season and previously. That they disproportionately face poverty. They disproportionately face mass incarceration. They disproportionately have lack of access to education and resources. We have a real problem in our country that we haven't repented of, that we haven't dealt with. And that affects all of us. That shapes us and how we think and how we act. As I continued reading, he says that you deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about these demonstrations. I've seen a lot of responses in the past week of people being against the protests that are taking place. A lot of the comments that are against the protests have to do with the rioting and the looting. But the vast majority of the protests that are taking place have been peaceful. There's been a few bad actors who have created damage. And yet, even the peaceful protesters are still being met with tear gas and rubber bullets. I think too often we decry the protests that are taking place, but we don't show a similar concern for the conditions that make those protests necessary. We aren't as concerned about the death of black and brown bodies as we are about some property damage from a few bad actors. I think that's something we have to deal with and we have to address and respond to. Probably the most gut-wrenching for me part of the letter that Martin Luther King wrote was this. He wrote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block is in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action.'" I don't think that it's enough for us to simply try not to use racial slurs or say things that are harmful about others. I don't think it's enough for us to simply try to treat people around us equally. I think that we have to seek to right the wrongs. I think that we have to seek to make things better. In Proverbs chapter 31, the author of Proverbs wrote, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy." If we're going to be faithful to the gospel of Jesus, a gospel that says that all people are made in God's image and are of sacred worth, then it's not enough for us to just try to not be racist. We have to be anti-racist. We have to actively seek to make things better. Actively seek to speak up for those who have no voice. I encourage you this week that if what I said upsets you or bothers you, I invite you to send me a message or call me and we'll talk about it. I'm happy to have that dialogue. I invite you to search your own heart and see what ways you might have benefited from a system of injustice or even added to it. I invite you to think about the ways that you might make it better. I've got a few options, a few things that you can do this week that are really simple. The simplest thing you can do is to simply learn more about the situations that we face in our country. You can watch The Hate You Give. It's a great movie. It's PG-13. It's family friendly. You can watch Just Mercy. It just recently came out. Both of those movies are available on Amazon Prime, so you don't even have to pay to watch them. Watch 13th on Netflix. You don't have to pay extra to watch it. It talks about mass incarceration and the way that affects people and people of color. I invite you to read the book Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, where he talks about his own experience of racism and his fears for his own child. Or White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. It talks about why it's so hard for us as white folks to talk about race and to deal with race. I invite you to speak up, to say something, to support people that you know, people in your community, or even people that you don't know who are people of color. I invite you to show up, to lend your support to local movements in your community that are dealing with racial injustice. I love y'all. Blessings. Peace.